Hi P6, it's time for us to think about Thursday's maths lesson. Now, to warm up, we are going to get underway once again with our numeracy ninja. It's day 4 of our challenge for this week. So if you're choosing the higher level task, then remember you're practicing all your tables from the 2 times table all the way up to the 12 times table, your multiplication and your division facts. If you choose to do the lower level task, then today you are concentrating on the 5 times table. P6, keep revising your tables please, and your dividing facts. It's so important that you know these really well. So please spend at least 10-15 minutes today practicing your tables. So that's your warm-up activity for today is Numeracy Ninja, and our main lesson today is going to be to do with decimals. Now there's some information on the website, but let's go through some information for ourselves. We have already been looking at what are called tenths, and we have learned that tenths means to divide something into 10 parts. So I've got my numerator, my denominator. The denominator tells me how many parts there are all together, and if I'm looking at one out of these 10 parts, I can say it's 1/10. And we have learned that I could write that as a decimal, which would be 0.1. We have learned that the number after the decimal point is what's called the tenths digit. It tells us how many out of the 10 parts we've got. Now today we're going to start looking at the next element of decimals, and that's something called hundredths. Hundredths, well, the clue is in the name. Instead of dividing something into 10 parts, instead, we're dividing it into 100 parts, like in this large square that's been divided up into 100 little squares. So if I was looking at one of these little squares, then I could say that that one square is 1/100th of the whole thing. And if I was to write that as a decimal, well, 1/100th becomes 0.01. The 0 for the units, because I haven't coloured the whole thing in. And once I start looking at hundredths, I have to have 2 numbers after the decimal point. And those 2 numbers together make up the hundredths. Now at the minute I've coloured in 1 out of the 100, so I would say 0.01. In decimals, I say each number separately, 0.01. If I was to colour in a few more, so let's say now I've coloured in 5 of them. If I've coloured in 5 of them, I could say I've coloured in 5 hundredths. And to write that as a decimal, I would write down 0.05. 0.05 just means I've coloured in 5 out of 100. What if I coloured in a few more? If I kept going and finished that first group of 10 and I coloured in another 2, how many have I coloured now? Well, I've coloured in 10 plus 2, so I've now coloured in 12 hundredths. 12 out of the 100 are coloured in. To write that as a decimal, I haven't coloured in the whole thing, so I've got my 0 at the start. How many out of the 100 have I coloured in? 12. So I put my 12 after it. But this is something that we need to remember. I don't say 0.12. In decimals, we say each number separately. So if I was saying this decimal number, I would say 0. Point, then I say each digit separately, 1, 2. I would say 0.12, not 0.12, 0.12. Say all the numbers separately. Now today, this is what we're going to be thinking about. We're going to be colouring in decimals, working out what different pictures are showing us. But actually you already know quite a bit about hundredths, because actually whenever we're doing work on money, P6, it's already to do with hundredths. Because if I have a 1p, that's the same as 1/100th of £1. If I was to write down £1.49, well, what does £1.49 mean? Well, it means that I've got a full £1 and I've got 49 100ths of the next pound. I've got a full pound. The 49p is 49 100ths of the next pound. So £1.49 is already a way of looking at hundredths. Now, we're going to look at a couple of pictures and we're going to see if we can use those to help us make sense of some decimals and using hundredths. So have a look at this first grid. Let's work out how many little squares we have coloured in. Now there are 100 altogether, there's 10 groups of 10. So let's see what we've coloured in. Well, I've coloured in a full group of 10. So there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. And then I've almost coloured in all of the next line. So how many have I coloured in altogether, P6? 70, and that has to be 9 more. So I could say there that I've coloured in 79 hundredths. 79 out of the 100 pieces. Now I can write 79 hundredths like that. I can write 79 hundredths like that. They both say exactly the same thing. How would I write it as a decimal? Well, I haven't coloured in the whole thing. So 0, because I haven't coloured in any whole squares. How many hundredths have I got? I've got 79. So I put it after the decimal point. And how will I say this number? I will say 0.79. Say the numbers separately. What can we see in this one? The one that's been coloured in with purple. Well, how many full groups of 10 have we got? We've got 10, 20, 30, and 1, 2, 3, 4 more. So in this one, I could say I've got 34 hundredths. So I could write it with the word hundredths. I could turn that into a fraction. The 34 is my numerator. The 100 becomes the denominator, so 34 hundredths. If I was to write that one as a decimal fraction, what would that be, P6? It's going to be 0, because I haven't coloured in the whole thing. Point, and the 34 hundredths go straight afterwards, but I don't say 34, 0.34. Let's have a look at this next one. Now, instead of the columns that have been coloured going vertically, this time they've been coloured and they've been coloured horizontally. So I've got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 and 3 more. Tell somebody in your house what's been coloured in. Can you think of it in 3 different ways? If 53 have been coloured in, how could I write that down? Have you told somebody? Well, we could say that we've got 53 hundredths. Hundredths just mean that something has been divided into 100 smaller parts. So I've got 53 hundredths. 53 hundredths. What would it be as a decimal? Now, can you say it properly? How would I say it as a decimal, P6? I'm going to say, yep, 0.53. So when I'm looking at hundredths, I have got 2 digits after the decimal point. The 2 digits after the decimal point tell me what the numerator tells me, how many out of 100 I actually have. Now, in all of these ones, we hadn't coloured in the whole square. So the units number was a 0 in each of them. But of course, it won't always be a 0. Have a look at this one. Look at the orange one. In this orange example, I've got 2 squares, both cut into 100 parts. The first one has been completely coloured in. The second one hasn't been completely coloured in. So what can I say about these? Well, the first one, the whole thing has been coloured in. So I can say that I've got 1 whole. Instead of the word whole, I could use the word unit. It's the same thing. So I've got 1 whole or 1 unit. And how much has been coloured in this one? Well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these little squares coloured in. So that would be 5 hundredths. So I've got 1 unit or 1 whole and 5 hundredths. I could write that as 1 and 5 hundredths, because that's the same thing. Oh, be careful, page 6. Can you see I've written a really tall one there? If I didn't make a tall one, oh, forget that. If I didn't make it a tall one, can you think what the difficulty would be if I put a small one instead of a tall one? What does that look like instead? Can you see that if you don't put a tall one, somebody might think you've written down 15 hundredths? So just be careful. So I've got 1 unit or 1 whole and 5 hundredths. I've got 1 and 5 hundredths. Now, how will I write that as a decimal? Well, as a decimal, if I'm thinking about my units, I've got 1 full unit. So the 1 goes before the decimal point. The 5 has to go after the decimal point, but it has to be 0.5. Because when I'm thinking about hundredths, I have to have 2 numbers after the decimal point. So 1.05. Be careful where you put that 0. It has to go in front of the 5, not after it. Because if I put it afterwards, by mistake, it would say 1.50. And that would mean that 50 of these squares were coloured in, not 5. So be really careful when you write down your decimals. If you need to, put in a 0 before the hundredths number if there's only 1 digit. Let's look at this one. The one that's been coloured in with green. What could we say about this? Well, how many full squares have been coloured in? Well, there's 1 and there's 2. So I could say that I've got 2 units or 2 whole squares. What's been coloured in this next one? Well, I can see that I've got 10, 20, 30, 31, 32, 33. So I can say that I have got 33 hundredths. So I've got 2 units and 33 hundredths. I could write it as a big 2 and 33 100ths. Same thing. How would I write it as a decimal? Well, that's going to be 2 point, then take your numerator and put it after the decimal point. How will I say it, P6? 2.33. Don't say 33, say each number separately. 2.33. Now, for your activities today, P6, you're going to download, first of all, this page. And on this page, and everybody's doing the pages today, this page we are thinking about a motorway bridge and the Alt Bridge. And on it there are lots of signs. Have you ever seen any of those signs at the side of the road or over roads that are used maybe to display warnings like slow, stop, wind, might be the speed limit, ice, go. Sometimes we get these signs, and these signs that we're looking at today are all made up of 100 little cells, 100 little squares. What you need to do is you need to follow the instructions on the page and show us in words, like in 47 hundredths, or as a fraction, or as a decimal, what's been coloured in. So in this example up above, they've looked at the word slow. They have carefully counted all the orange little squares, and altogether there were 47 of those were coloured in. So they have said, well, that's the same as 47 hundredths, or I could write it as a fraction, 47 hundredths, or I could write it as a decimal, 0.47. Now what you need to do in part 1 is set your work out for these 5 questions exactly the same way as they did that one. In part 2, read through this bit of information and then you're going to write down each of these as a decimal. So if you've got 23 hundredths, well, let's think 23 hundredths. So 23 hundredths looks like that. What's that going to be as a decimal? Yep, it's going to be 0 point, and then the numerator goes after the decimal point, 0.23. So you're going to, for each of these questions, have a go at writing them out as a decimal. In part 3, you're going to take the decimals and try and write them down in two other ways. So you're going to write them down in hundredths with the word hundredths and the number 100 as your denominator. Now your final question on this page is an ordering question. And if it helps, think of them as money. You've been given 5 decimal fractions, 6 decimal fractions in fact, along each line. And what you need to do is put those decimals in order, starting with the smallest one. Think of them as money and you'll find it very easy. So that's your first task, and that's a written task. Your second task, P6, is to do some colouring. So grab some of your colouring pencils or Sharpies or Twistables, whatever you've got. And for this page, you're going to be doing some colouring. So in the first part, you have been given a decimal, and that's what you need to go and colour in. So if you've been told to colour in 0.52, then you will need to go and colour in 52 of the little squares. It doesn't matter which 52 you colour in, but make sure it is exactly 52. 0.60, that will mean 60. 0.08, just 8. 0.77, colouring in 77. In the next ones, some of the whole squares have already been coloured in, like in this example. So look at the example. Can you give the answer to these two questions? And then down at the bottom of the page, for this one, can you colour in 1.61? So one whole square and 61 hundredths of the next one. 2.06, so 2 whole rectangles and 6 100ths of the next one. And then at the bottom of the page, have a go at completing these decimals. So you've got 2 main parts to your activity today, P6, and everybody is doing both parts, okay? There aren't different levels, there are simply 2 different tasks. So you've got a written task, and then you've got a task that involves a lot of colouring. P6, once you have got all of those done, then also today you have got a reasoning activity, and today's reasoning activity is all to do with lines and shapes. You've got some odd one out questions, and you've also got a question where you have to decide whether you agree with the statement or not. And then finally, to finish off today, I know that when you were in P5, lots of you enjoyed playing Hit the Button, and you've probably played it a few times in P6 as well. So why don't you head to the Top Marks website and go and play a few games of Hit the Button. Choose the game that you want to play. Do you want to look at your tables? Do you want to do dividing, halves, doubles, number bonds, square numbers? You choose which one you want to have a go at and see what score you can get today. Good luck.